Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider, with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each week to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes and open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. With that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. I frequently, those of you who join me every week will know that I frequently start my remarks by saying there's a lot going on. Well, many times when I've said that, I doubt if there's even been a fraction of what's gone on this week. I can't remember a more intensive week than outside of elections, wars, things like that, than the last 7 days. Even the last few hours has been pretty intense. So there's a lot to get through, a lot of different issues. I'll try and do some of them justice. So we'll quickly go in with, the main thing appears to be on the mind of many in Israel and around the world, which is the judicial reform. So this week we had, for the first time, some actual votes in the Knesset. As I've explained previously, the government decided in the end to break up the judicial reform and pass it piecemeal. First of all, because then it'll be harder for the Supreme Court to strike it down, and also it'll be more detailed. And for various other reasons, because they wanted to get the judicial appointments bill passed through ahead of a judicial appointments committee meeting in a couple of months, which will, I think, replace at least 2 members of the Supreme Court bench. So they wanted to get that through as quickly as possible. Obviously, the larger the legislation, the more details, the more issues are involved, the harder it is to pass. So it was a decision by committee, a judicial and law and constitutional committee head, Simcha Rotman, a while ago, I'm sure in consultation with Justice Minister Yariv Levin and even Prime Minister Netanyahu, to do it piecemeal. This week we had, as I said, the first law, which was to change the makeup of the judicial appointments. That has been controversial by opponents because it changes the balance from the judiciary, which has a majority, and the bar association, et cetera, away as it currently is, where the politicians, the elected representatives, are a minority on the Judicial Appointments Committee. The new law, which has only passed the first reading, it's not law yet, so it's really still a bill, will eventually, it's intended to give the government a majority on the Judicial Appointments Committee. We've explained previously why opponents and proponents agree or disagree on that. The other law which was passed this week was the ability of the Supreme Court to review basic laws. We've explained in the past, again, that Israel doesn't have a constitution, but it does have basic laws which have a quasi-constitutional basis. The Supreme Court, ever since the Barak Revolution in the 90s, not Ehud Barak, the former Supreme Court president, Aaron Barak, basic laws were given quasi-constitutional authority, and they were used to strike down laws over the years. Many laws, in fact, most of the laws that were struck down over the years by the Supreme Court were on the basis of these basic laws having a higher level than regular laws. Well, this law will allow the government or the coalition to basically suggest or write into a law that it is now a basic law, which will not then, according to the law that's being passed now, I'm sorry if it's a bit confusing, which will then allow the Supreme Court not to review and reject it. So those are the first 2 laws that were passed through the first reading with the expected majority. Pretty much everyone in the coalition, apart from Yuli Edelstein, who's in Ukraine, voted for it. All of the opposition voted against it, except Yisrael Beitenu. Avigdor Lieberman decided not to even, in his words, even give it the ability by voting against it. So everyone in the opposition, basically the votes went a lot in coalition on opposition lines, except for I think it's the 6 seats of Yisrael Beitenu. And as I said, Yuli Edelstein is in Ukraine with I can't remember his name, a politician for the opposition. So it was offset. But basically, what we did see is really scenes that we've never seen before in Israel. We saw demonstrations again take to the streets, not as large as the previous Monday. We saw about 80,000 circumnavigate, I should say, the Knesset. Many of the streets in downtown Jerusalem, especially around the government buildings and the Knesset, were completely closed. There were even, which got a lot of news, there were attempts to force some members of Knesset to stay at home, not to come to the Knesset. Simcha Rotman woke up and left his house and was greeted by a human roadblock of a few dozen people who tried to prevent him from even getting into his car and leaving his town. More controversially, a member of Likud, Tali Gottlieb, who was trying to leave her apartment, was basically blocked from leaving her apartment by something like 10 individuals. And when she said, please, can you keep it down because she has a special needs, a daughter at home, they said, well, she's going to be staying at home with you today, so get used to it. And that caused, one can imagine, quite a lot of outrage. Inside the Knesset as well, there was scenes, again, I can tell you as someone who spends a lot of time in the Knesset, I've never seen such scenes. I wasn't there myself. That there were people in the visitors gallery who banged on the glass, separating the visitors gallery from the main plenum, shouting, screaming, that the end of democracy, etc., etc. We saw, even more demonstrations, actions, petitions around the world. The EU got involved. We saw, I think, earlier today, I think that's pretty unprecedented. The language that was used in the US, again, even from the top, the White House put out, again, their concerns about judicial reform. We even saw the Human Rights Commission, the UN Human Rights Commission, which, as we know, is housed by some countries which are not known for exactly human rights basis, which do not have an independent, not only judiciary, but legislature and executive. Some of the most autocratic nations on earth, or the representative of that, basically criticized Israel's judicial reform. So one can imagine, the hypocrisy there. But again, we saw even mainstream Jewish organizations are now starting to get involved. The Jewish federations wrote a message today, which was welcomed by opposition, Yair Lapid. And again, the types of things that we've witnessed over the last few days are pretty unprecedented. I can't remember a single issue, maybe going back Oslo, and even then, maybe not, where there's been such a response, such divisions, not just in Israel, in the Jewish world and the pro-Israel world. One of the major factors, at least according to the opponents of judicial reform, is the economic effect, which has been touted already for a few weeks, where a sort of never-ending list of venture capitalists, investors, and people who run investment companies, banks, et cetera, have said that the judicial reforms are going to have a major impact on the Israeli economy. And whether that is real, whether that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, is certainly up to debate, depending on where you come down on the particular side of the political division. What we are seeing is, again, whether it's the reforms or the fear of the reforms, or whether it's the noise around them, what we are seeing is the shekel weakened significantly against foreign currencies. We saw the shekel rise to a low, I guess, against the American dollar. It's now up to 3.67, which we haven't seen in many, many years. Inflation is going up, even though, again, the interest rates were raised in Israel another 50 points. It's now at 4.25. And don't forget, only a year ago, the interest rate was 0.25. So really, really significant. That was an act by the head of the Bank of Israel, and that was attacked by several politicians, mostly from the Likud, who said that the Bank of Israel should not be raising interest rates at this point, and one can imagine the backlash against that. Interestingly enough, Prime Minister Netanyahu, the head of the Likud party, had to come out in defense of the head of the Bank of Israel and said that they need to be independent, they need to have the authority to raise interest rates to deal with inflation, and no one should tell them what to do with their job. On the military security front, we saw today something, again, not unprecedented, but certainly we haven't seen in a while, where about 100 IDF soldiers and security officers entered Nablus Shem in the middle of the day to take 3 gunmen out, some very senior gunmen from the Lion's Den terrorist organization, from the Islamic Jihad. And as one can imagine, many Palestinian gunmen came to try and defend these 3 that they wanted to either capture or apprehend or take out. And in the end, 10 Palestinians were killed and many more injured. I don't believe that there were any fatalities on the Israeli side, but it certainly has not been left without response so far, only verbally, from all the terrorist organizations one can imagine, and they have promised revenge. This has certainly been the most deadly first couple of months of a calendar since, as many pointed out, since the Second Intifada. I believe that there's something like 60 Palestinians who have been killed, the vast majority of them terrorists, since the beginning of the year. And these numbers, as I said, are, have not been met since 2001, which was the beginning of the Intifada. So it remains to be seen exactly what will be the response, but pretty much all the terrorist organizations have promised some very painful response. On the issue of settlements, we heard last week that Israel has given the okay to build 10,000 new homes. There was supposed to be a UN resolution condemning it. There was a lot of diplomacy behind the scenes with the US convincing its partners on the Security Council not to put up a resolution. In the end, they put out more of a condemnation. Israel, although they were they're certainly happy that it wasn't a resolution, they were still not happy with the wording. It was, of course, very one-sided. And even the prime minister or the government, I can't remember which spokesperson exactly came out with it, but said that not only were they unhappy with the wording, but they were unhappy with the US's role and even vote in favor of it, which again is relatively unprecedented that a high level Israeli politician, especially in the government, would so openly criticize the US's role in that. On what really is probably the most pressing issue, especially in Prime Minister Netanyahu's mind, is Iran. We've spoken about that. Every other security threat for him and many others in the security establishment pale into significance with the threat of Iran. And this week we had an IAEA report that said that Iran has managed to enrich to 84%. That's way above their previous levels of 60%, which are way above what they're allowed to do under the Iran nuclear agreement. And it's perilously close to the 90% threshold, which is necessary to pass to be able to get the correct level of enrichment, uranium enrichment, to build a nuclear bomb. So that, as one can imagine, caused a lot of stir. Netanyahu certainly tried to bring as much attention to it, tried to really stress, as he has done in recent meetings behind closed doors, also openly and publicly, that the international community has to take the Iran situation far more seriously. The message which he's been getting out this week to the Americans, to the Europeans, is there needs to be a credible threat on the table. And the examples he's using is, how did the Iraqi nuclear weapons capability get stopped? Through military action. The same with the Syrian nuclear weapons program. And so he's really tried to ratchet up the concern that Israel is showing to the international community. There has even been leaked even further warnings that Netanyahu is sat with the most senior security and army officials to try and put down a plan to how to stop Iran, if they need to do it unilaterally, And we saw that Defense Minister Yoav Gallant came out very, openly and said, for Israel, this 90% is a red line, and if necessary, they will take action. This is really to try and ratchet up Israel's concern, really try and put it on the put it on the plate of the international community, because it's certainly something that very much concerns Israel. Finally, we heard from Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, who gave a speech, who tried to play off the, let's say, I wouldn't say there's civil unrest, but certainly there's great divisions within Israel over the judicial reform issue. And as we know, Israel's enemies are very studious in following Israel's political and diplomatic developments, and have tried to use this to show that Israeli society is breaking apart. And this means in Nasrallah's words, the beginning of the end for Israel. Try to give hope to his people and his supporters and those who would like to see the destruction of Israel, by claiming that Israel will not see its 80th birthday. As we know, Israel is celebrating 75 years this year. So again, we saw that Israel's enemies are trying to make hay out of what is happening within Israel, with the breaches in society, with such divisions over the judicial reform and other issues relating to that. But again, a lot of it is tied in. But as I said, a lot going on. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions on anything I've mentioned or anything else that's on your mind.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question is from Carrie Hillebrand, asking, in the tragic aftermath of the earthquakes in Turkey, is there any movement to bring older buildings up to seismic code? I know we did talk about this last time.
I mean, there's nothing really new. There's talk of committees. There's talk of what Israel should be doing. Again, they're trying to see what plans are most effective. It seems like still the Tama plan, which is to add floors to make it more attractive to investors, while reinforcing older buildings, still seems to be the only game in town. I'm sure that there are people who are discussing it, but again, as I said last time, the actual government committee on earthquake preparedness still hasn't met for a number of years, and with everything else that's going on, Israel's the Israeli political scene, the attention of the Israeli political scene is still elsewhere. But hopefully there are people who are dealing with it behind the scenes.
Thank you. Norman Lipoff asks, is there any sign of compromise activity on the judicial reform proposed legislation?
Well, there are talks behind the scenes. It would be unfair to say that there's no talks. Opposition leader Yair Lapid publicly is very much saying that I'm not going to come to the table until there is a complete halt. He did say about a week ago that he demands at least a 60-day hiatus on any legislation. That's clearly not happening. But President Herzog gave a much lower figure, and Lapid said, he would defer to the president on that. But the fact is that the official opposition is not coming to talks. There's no official talks. There are outreaches behind the scenes. And interestingly, Prime Minister Netanyahu gave the impression that if the official opposition doesn't come to talks, maybe he'll invite NGOs, experts, judicial experts, etc., who then he will discuss with to see whether there can be some compromise. I should go back to what I just said. Prime Minister Netanyahu is, according to the Attorney General, not allowed to engage in the issue openly and publicly because it's stated that he has a conflict of interest because of his legal cases. So he's not really allowed to be involved with it. But that's basically what's happening. Is there are movements, there are talks, nothing official, certainly nothing at the highest level. But there's no hiatus, there's no halt in the legislative program. Already there's talk about what's going to be in the next day, where there's votes. They're already pushing through the next batch of bills for the judicial reform. So at the moment, both sides are taking, I would say to a certain extent, a maximalist approach. but it wouldn't surprise me if at some point there are talks, because all sides have welcomed it, tentatively. And there are some, for example, like former Defense Minister Benny Gantz, who is more open to it than someone like Yair Lapid. So there's even fractures even within the opposition, exactly the strategy to try and get the government to the table to try and talk about how there can be some compromises and concessions.
Thank you. Art T asks, can you comment on who these demonstrators are? Are they making an excuse to make Israel look bad? Are they simply bullies? And how many are really knowledgeable and sincere? Especially, he brings up the Palestinian flags for some of them, and the Hezbollah's attempt to use this.
Right. Well, certainly in the last few demonstrations, there haven't been any Palestinian flags. There's been an array of Israeli flags. The interesting thing is, if you look at it, is most of the Israeli flags are relatively uniform, which means they are being handed out. So there is someone who's funding it, but there are no Palestinian flags. I would argue that to a certain extent, it's a cross-section of Israeli society. You will see people from all levels of society. Dudi Amsalem from the Likud accused them of being the elites. Look at all the Rolexes that they wore. And I think he said all the BMWs that were driven. And he was mocked for that because while he was talking about the Rolexes, he was wearing a watch which was even more expensive than a Rolex. I think, it's a little bit unfair to say that it's only the sort of top levels of society. Certainly, it's disproportionately on the left and the center. It probably, is in large part people coming from the central area, less from the periphery. It would be hard to say that 80 to 100,000 people are stooges for some sort of conspiracy. They obviously do feel very strongly about it. How much do they actually understand? I think, like in everything, I think the majority of people probably don't know every detail. They understand that there's something which they would like to challenge. They call out democratia, which means democracy. They believe that democracy is at stake here. They believe authoritarianism is around the corner. Of course, as many know, that's far from what's happening. But that is what is being stressed by the leaders of the opposition. And that's a message that, as I said, is very much getting through to the international community, Jewish communities abroad. But for example, on Saturday night, Yoash Hendel, who we know was a former minister of communications, held what he described as a right-wing rally against judicial reform, where he invited people from the right-wing base, people who consider themselves right-wing on security issues, on many other issues, who came to a separate. They didn't want to necessarily be associated with the main demonstration, but they held their own demonstration in Jerusalem. I'm not clear exactly on the numbers, but there are right-wing people against it, left-wing people against it, religious, secular, etc., etc. But certainly, probably the majority are left-wing, largely secular. When I say left-wing, probably more centrist because the left is very small today in Israel. But certainly there is a substantial amount of people who are aggrieved by it, according to polls that they've shown on Israeli TV. Even within the Likud voters, there's at least 40% of people who would like the judicial reform process to stop at this point in time, to give more time for discussions, for compromises, for concessions. So even, I think, within the base of Likud, there are those who are buying into the proposition that this is problematic, that this is a challenge to Israel's system. And so there are people, as I said, from pretty much across the spectrum who would like the process to stop, maybe not necessarily stay as it is. I think there's not that great number, especially not in Likud, to have the current situation stay as it is. But certainly amongst all sectors of society, there is a certain and perhaps even growing level of concern.
Thank you so much for that. Reuven Hawk asks, doesn't the Attorney General also have a conflict of interest in being involved in the judicial reform issue, since part of the reform affects the power and role of the Attorney General?
bottom line is yes, and that's what many in the Likud and the coalition are arguing. But at the end of the day, she has her role. There are those who have suggested this week, to a lot of consternation, again on opponents of judicial reform, that she should be fired from her position because of this conflict of interest. But that was shot down by the Justice Minister himself, Yariv Levin. But I wouldn't say that if they had the chance that her days are going to be the longest in number, but we'll have to wait and see on that. But at this moment in time, it's an argument that's being made. It's part of the narrative of the proponents of judicial reform that there is a conflict of interest here. But I don't think that she will quit, and I don't think she'll be fired at this point.
Thank you. And can you just talk about Ukraine for a minute? Is there moves being made there? Larry Greenberg points out that Israel is about to send U.S. missiles there. And how does this affect Israel's relations with Russians, especially in Syria?
Israel is about to send U.S. missiles. To the best of my knowledge, that's not true, and I very much doubt that. There were suggestions. The Ukrainians would certainly like to see Israel provide military equipment. It hasn't done so far. I would be surprised if Israel does give any significant military equipment to Ukraine. As I said, there was Yuli Edelstein, who was there this week with, his name escapes me, a former Likud member who's now with the opposition, with Benny Gantz's party. They were both there in Ukraine meeting with President Zelensky. And there was talk of Israel providing missiles or other military equipment, but it's coming from the Ukrainian side. At the moment, there's no suggestion that Israel, I'm not ruling it out completely in the future, but I don't believe at this point Israel is seriously considering, because that would be a game changer as far as Israel's relationship with Russia, which, as I've said before many times, still needs to maintain because of its role with Iran, its role in Syria, etc., etc.
Thank you. And as far as this daytime raid goes on Nablus, that's out of the ordinary, correct? The daytime raids. So this must have been an impending threat. Can you just talk
such
about
a large number? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. If you could just expand on that a bit.
Well, as I said, usually if Israel wants to arrest, apprehend terrorists, those who have committed attacks, those who will commit attacks, and these three gunmen apparently fell into both camps. They've been involved with previous shootings of Israelis, and there was warnings that they will be again. So usually these things take place at night. Israel goes in, in the middle of the night, or if they do go in during the day, it's more pinpointed. It's usually more controlled. But the fact that there were over 100 Israeli security personnel going into the middle of Nablus, Shem, so they sent a very serious message. By the way, in the Palestinian Authority, apparently there's a lot of consternation about the official Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas, and they claim that they had a role themselves. And there are these pictures on social media of an official Palestinian police force leaving the scene as the Israelis came. So it certainly doesn't bolster the credibility of the Palestinian Authority, but certainly to put such a large force in the middle of the day into such a busy part of a major city in the Palestinian Authority, it's not unprecedented, of course, but certainly it's another level to what we've seen recently.
Absolutely. Thank you. Barak Korkmaz asks, what do you think about the Turkish-Israeli collaboration on the Iranian nuclear threat?
I mean, there's not really much that I'm aware of. I don't really understand the question so well, because Israel is not really focusing collaboration with Turkey to try and stymie the Iranian nuclear threat. It's mostly with the West, the P5+1, chiefly the Americans. Turkey and Iran are regional rivals, and perhaps, I'm sure, there are some conversations which are happening, and if there's anything Turkey can do, but at this stage, that's certainly not the focus of Israel's attempts diplomatically and internationally to stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons capability.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And with that, we've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us. For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Ambassador L. Paul Bremer III discussing Iraq 20 years after the fall of Saddam Hussein. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.